Michele. I'm the Director of Education for Gregory's Coffee in New York City. I run our training program. I support somewhere around 300 baristas and leaders and other people in the company. So I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Michele Ramsey is an Associate Professor of Communication Arts and Sciences and Women's Studies at Penn State Berks. She teaches a number of classes at the college, including gender and communication and conflict management. Her talk today will focus on managing conflict and emotional behavior in the coffee workplace. The discussion will focus on misconceptions about conflict, the role of power, and ways to manage oneself and others to help mitigate the negative impact of emotional behavior. So let's hear it for Michele.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I want to start off by asking you a question. And it's the same question I ask my students the first day of conflict management class every semester that I teach it. And that is to think to yourself what the first word is that comes to your mind when I say the word conflict. Most of the time, that word's a negative one, and that makes some sense. Conflict is something that we have to deal with every day in our lives, in our workplace, in our interpersonal relationships. But most of us don't get any training on how to deal with conflict or emotional labor that goes along with conflict. And so it makes sense that we don't necessarily have great positive feelings about the word conflict because it can cause a lot of trouble and we don't really ever learn much about how to mitigate that trouble. So that's a little bit of what I want to do today. Conflict management is a 15-week class, and so making this 18 minutes is tough. But I hope that I can leave you with a few ideas and maybe some things to think about, directions to go off into after we've finished talking. The first thing to know about conflict is that it's normal. One of the myths about conflict is that harmony is normal and conflict is abnormal. But in fact, both of them are normal. So this idea that our relationships function like harmony, 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 conflict, harmony, harmony, conflict, it's really more like harmony, conflict, harmony, harmony, conflict, harmony, conflict. Conflict and harmony ebb and flow in our relationships. And so it's a part of our world. We might as well start trying to learn some ways to deal with it effectively. So those negative feelings you have about conflict, I hope I can change them a little bit, get you to understand that conflict just is. It isn't necessarily negative or positive, but it's how we manage that conflict and how we deal with it that makes it a positive or negative thing in our lives. The second thing to understand about conflict is that there's always an element of power. So person that you're having conflict with, you probably have some sort of either power balance or power imbalance. And power is the product of a social relationship. Nobody's born with power. Not even the Queen of England is born with power. That person only gets power when someone gives it to them. And so people who work in the service industry, you have to give people a lot of power every day, especially if you're someone who's on the front lines with customers working every day. You have to deal with a power imbalance, the expectation that you're going to talk to and treat that customer in a way that brings them back, regardless of how they treat you. And that's a lot of emotional labor that goes into dealing with that power imbalance. So you have some of the heaviest burdens when it comes to power imbalance and dealing with power imbalance. And that dealing with power imbalance is about emotional labor. And what we mean when we talk about emotional labor is just the labor that goes into dealing with how you're going to deal with your emotions, conflicts, but also, and maybe even more so, in the case of people in the service industry, dealing with the fact that you're unable to express what you want to express sometimes. So even though someone is treating you in an unkind way, you don't have the privilege of responding the way that you would like to. You don't get to express the emotions you'd like to, or express the emotion that you would express if they were treating you that way outside of the workplace. So emotional labor is about the kind of labor we do in the workplace as part of our jobs, and how we have to do work to manage how we express ourselves, and even, and maybe even more importantly, how we don't get to express ourselves sometimes. Everybody in the service industry has to deal with this, but women and minorities have to deal with it a tad bit more, and maybe even a lot more in some cases. Women have to deal with, just like with minority status, have to deal with the fact that there's a lower status in our society in general. And that lower status comes with a lot of stereotypes and assumptions about behavior. So women have to deal with gender role stereotypes about you should always smile, you should always be nice, you should be mothering and nurturing and kind all the time because you're a woman. When you don't do those things, or when you don't do them to the extent that someone thinks that you should, they may be a little bit harder on you. They may not treat you as well as they would otherwise because you are ignoring their gender role expectation. Someone in minority status, non-white status, has to deal with the same sorts of things. There are stereotypes, typically very negative, that keep those power relations and those status differences intact. And so folks in minority status that have to deal with the public also have to have the ability to deal with a lot more, I think, power imbalance and also a lot more emotional labor. And so everybody in the service industry has a lot of emotional labor that they have to deal with, but I think that women and people of minority status have to deal with some more of it. And one other way that they have to deal with some more of it is through the decoding of nonverbal communication. You've probably all heard the phrase walking on eggshells, right? But what does that mean? What that tends to mean is that we are paying close attention to someone else. We're looking at their eyes, we're looking at their hands, we're looking at their facial expressions, we're listening to their vocal intonations to try to figure out what it is they're thinking, they're feeling, and how we should behave in response to keep ourselves safe. So women and minorities have to do a lot more of that. We find in research that they tend to be better at decoding nonverbals because as people in lower status positions, they have to do it a lot more often. So everybody that works in the service industry has to deal with a lot of emotional labor. You all have to deal with decoding nonverbals and trying to figure out what the person in front of you is feeling and how you should respond. But women and minorities, they do have a somewhat higher burden in that regard. And so what do all these feelings that are connected to this emotional labor cause? One of the first things they cause is for people to feel inauthentic, to feel hypocritical. Because you're having to put on a mask, because you're having to say something that maybe you don't really feel, that takes a lot of energy, and it also stops you from being the person that you really are. It's part of the workplace. We all have to do it as people who work. I have to do it at a university, but it's still labor. And so that those feelings of inauthenticity and hypocrisy, if we have to experience that often, can really have some negative consequences. And if we don't take care of those feelings, they have really serious consequences. One of the consequences is burnout, which is just waking up and saying, I can't do this today. Right? I just don't have it in me physically, I don't have it in me mentally to deal. And that's what burnout is. You're out of gasoline. There's nothing in the tank to get that work done that day. And when we feel burnout, we tend to miss work. It could be legitimately missing work. We know that negative emotions and negativity hurts our health. It impacts our health negatively. So it could be legitimately you miss work because you're burnt out and your body's just had it and you become sick. But it can also be you miss work because you're just not going to work today. You're not going to deal with it. You don't feel like doing that. You can't do that. And so people miss work as a result of those feelings of burnout that come when we have to feel inauthentic a lot of the day. We also can start to develop less empathy for people. When you have to walk around and wear that mask and be that person that you're not, that's part of that emotional labor that's a part of your job. You're not who you really are, and it becomes harder to reach out and have authentic communication, authentic relationships with other people. And so in spite of the fact that you may be a person who really wants to feel empathy for everyone, it becomes harder for you because you do sometimes have to walk in with that mask and sort of the wall that protects you and your emotions from that emotional labor work. And then finally, we see lower levels of commitment to an organization. When people feel burnt out, when people feel like they are putting in so much emotional labor, they start to have less commitment for their organization. It's absolutely fair. You go in, you have an expectation for your job, and you get a paycheck. That's the deal. But that deal doesn't work for long periods of time unless you feel like you're getting something else out of that situation. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But when we feel like we're giving and giving and giving, and especially you're giving from your core, right? You're ignoring your own emotions, you're ignoring the things that you want to say. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of energy, and you can start to feel bad about it and feel less committed to where it is that you are. So what are some things that specifically you folks that are on the front line, the baristas, can do to help deal with some of the energy that happens when you have to put out a lot of emotional labor? One of the things that you should do, if you can, is leave the floor. Get out of that space and go into another one. Get out of the place that's causing you to feel the way you're feeling and go somewhere else where you don't have to engage with that. Switch emotions if you can. So instead of thinking and keeping focus on what just happened, the negative experience you just had, all the emotional labor you had to put out, think about something more positive. Your plans for the weekend, your plans for tonight, your significant other, family, something that's going to make you feel happy. Try to replace those negative emotions with happy emotions, and those negative emotions aren't going to be able to have the impact on you that they would otherwise. Deep breaths. I know that you can't leave the floor and go into full-on meditation. I get that. But what I always tell my public speaking students is you can't just run up to the lectern and start speaking. You have to walk up, ground yourself, take a deep breath. And the reason I tell them to take a deep breath is because all that adrenaline that's happening when they're dealing with their worst fear, it gets expelled from the body. And some of that adrenaline goes away. And so that's what I mean when I talk about deep breaths, that those feelings that we have, the emotional labor that we have to put out causes adrenaline, causes anxiety. And if you can take some really good deep breaths, some of that anxiety, that adrenaline will leave your body and you're going to feel a little bit better. Maybe most importantly, though, is effective social support. So when someone has to leave the floor, they've just had it and they need to take a break, it's great if someone can go with them. And when someone goes with them, they need to give effective social support. And what a lot of us tend to do is listen. Yeah, you're right. Oh my God, that person's the worst. They're always horrible when they come in here. I totally get it. It happened to me last week. That's not effective social support. What that's doing is just piling on that negativity. And not only are you letting that person roll around in that negativity for longer, you're bringing it into yourself. So what does effective social support mean? Follow that person. I get it. I'm sorry you had that experience. It does feel terrible. I hope you'll be able to go and do something fun tonight. I get it. I feel ya. Instead of piling on, and again, that piling on comes from a good place. We want to show that we understand, we get it. But when the way that we do that, the way that we show that we get it, can actually be more negative, right? It brings that emotion, that negative emotion up, and you just keep building up on it. So more effective social support, I understand, I get it, I know you're frustrated, I'm sorry, is going to help them get all that stuff out, but not build on it. In terms of the long term, one of the things that I think folks on the front lines have to do is consider what we call career identity. And someone with high career identity, we know from research, doesn't tend to be as negatively impacted by emotional labor as someone who doesn't have it. But what do I mean by high career identity? I'll give myself as an example. With my degree, with my skill sets, I'm pretty sure I could have gone a different direction. I could have gone in the corporate world. I'd be making a heck of a lot of money than I am as a humanities professor. But that wasn't my calling. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach. And so because I have high career identity, I'm where I feel like I need to be, it's easier for me to deal with that emotional labor. It doesn't tend to impact people as negatively when they have high career identity. So I'd ask you to think about, is this where you want to be? Is this really what you want to do? Is this the profession that you want to have? And if the answer is, I don't know, or no, you can still stay in that position, but that emotional labor is going to take a much higher toll on you because you're not in a position that you love and that you feel called to. So you want to consider your career identity. You also want to make sure you don't bottle up negative emotion. We know that negative emotion, again, it hurts your day-to-day wellness, but we also know that bottling up of negative emotion is positively correlated to cancer rates. And so you're not just talking about your day-to-day health, you're talking about your long-term health. And so I'd ask you again, consider your career identity and make sure you're in a place that isn't hurting your health, because that emotional labor and the negative emotions that can go along with all that labor you have to produce can hurt you. For immediate supervisors, people who are supervising and training baristas, that supportive climate I talked about starts with you. So you have to create a climate where people socialize, they like each other, you don't let conflict sit and fester. You're somebody who's able to see these two people are having a conflict, I'm gonna pull them aside, we're gonna work this out, so that that conflict doesn't boil and boil and boil until it explodes, or worse, that conflict doesn't infect the whole organization with people taking sides, and now you've got 20 people conflicting instead of just 2. So you have to be somebody who understands and who can see that stuff happening and can fix it. You also have to be somebody who sets up those informal means of social support. So you have to communicate to people that if it's possible and you need to leave the floor, take those deep breaths, give yourself a few minutes to deal with that emotional labor. And if somebody can go out with you and help you, that's great. I know everybody can't just pick up and leave the floor when somebody's had a bad time, but if you let them know that if it's possible, get off the floor, deal with your emotion, take care of yourself, let a friend help you. The rest of us will pick up the slack. So that means that supervisor is picking up the slack too, taking out the trash, doing whatever that person has to do so that your employees can take better care of themselves when they're dealing with emotional labor. You also want to make sure that as a supervisor, you don't emphasize those interpersonal demands of the job. I think everybody in the service industry knows you got to put on that smiley face, right? You have to talk to people in a way that's going to encourage them to come back. We all understand that. I've had plenty of service industry jobs too. So you don't need to hammer that home all the time. People understand that that's their job. You just need to help them be able to do that more effectively. And what we know from research about supervisors who constantly focus on those interpersonal demands is that literally the people that work for them, they lose dexterity. So you're not helping anybody if you constantly are banging the drum of that interpersonal stuff. It freaks people out, it makes them nervous, and they can't do what they have to do as well as if you were a little more calm about that stuff. And then finally, as a supervisor, you've got to jettison your quirks and your moods. That supportive environment starts with you, and so when you walk in that door, your job is not to add another level of eggshells for people to have to walk on. We're already having to deal with a lot of emotional labor, dealing with customers, suppliers, all of that stuff. So when the supervisor walks in and that organization has to start watching their eye contact, watching their vocal intonation, watching how they're moving. Are they in a bad mood? How should I act? Am I acting too happy? Am I not acting happy enough? You're making their job harder. They've already got a really hard job, but when you walk in and you let your bad mood or your quirk for the day impact that organization, you're giving them another level of eggshells that they have to walk on. And so do your best, I think, to try and not bring that stuff into the workplace and make it easier for the folks that work for you, not harder. In terms of folks who own or who are in higher management of these types of organizations, perfect your hiring practices, which for me means 2 things. Number one, you want to try to hire people with high emotional intelligence. People who understand conflict management, they understand how people need to regulate their emotions and how to best do that. They understand that it's their role to create that supportive climate. If you hire someone that has high emotional intelligence, they're going to be better at managing all of that stuff that goes along with the industry. They're also going to be better at protecting everyone that works for them. And so think about those hiring practices in terms of emotional intelligence. You also want to pick people that have high career identity as managers. There's a big difference, and you've probably all experienced this. There's a big difference between someone who sees people as true human resources, that they want to grow, that they want to build, that they want to develop, and people who just want to be bosses, who just want a higher paycheck or just want a better title. You want to hire the first person. You want to hire the person who values those human resources and who does what they need to do to protect and to grow those resources, not just somebody who wants to be a boss. The other thing to think about is training managers to understand that impact, to tell them, this is the kind of organizational climate I want in my coffee house, and here are the ways that I want you to make sure you get that to happen. So training supervisors for your expectations about how you're going to have them deal with employees, deal with the emotional labor and the conflict that they have to deal with, train them exactly how you want them trained. And then finally, I would encourage you to invest in training in emotional regulation, in conflict management, and not just training for managers, training for everybody. If you remember just a few minutes ago, I talked about how sometimes people's commitment to an organization gets lower because they feel like they're putting in and putting in and putting in, and they get a paycheck, and that's great, but they don't get a whole lot more. You can change that equation. When you decide, hey, I'm not just going to teach my managers how to better manage their emotions or how to better deal with conflict, I'm going to teach everybody. You're giving your employees something in conflict management we call power currencies. You're giving them skill sets, and not only are those skill sets going to help them deal with customers, suppliers, roasters, all of that, it's going to help them deal with their own conflict outside of work too, and that's going to make them happier. So everybody wins when entire organizations get some training in emotional management and conflict management. So just to sort of wrap up, a few things to remember. Conflict just is. It's not bad, it's not good, it just exists. And one of the things we really all need to work on is learning how to manage it better. For people who are in minority status and women, you have a higher burden of emotional labor often, and so you have to take particular care of yourself with regard to those higher levels of emotional labor. But everybody needs to take care of themselves. When they need to take care of themselves, go do it. Get off the floor, take those deep breaths, think positive thoughts, provide social support for each other. And then managers and owners, set the tone. Let your organization know that you understand what emotional labor is, you understand what it costs people, and you're going to do everything in your power to make sure that they are able to manage that emotional regulation. And everybody wins. Customers win, baristas win, roasters win, suppliers win, owners win, managers win. When everybody knows how to better manage this stuff, everybody wins. So that's it. I'm happy to sit and talk a little bit. Yeah, thanks.